this isn't science fiction, but it does speak to Ray Bradbury's great distinction of the difference between fantasy and science fiction. Fantasy is the thing that you want to happen and will never happen. Science fiction is the thing that you don't want to happen, but it will inevitably happen.
Michael Oatman is here. He's an artist and a professor at RPI. At Mass MoCA, his installation is legendary. It's called All Utopias Fell. And at RPI, his class on Alfred Hitchcock is Cinetecture, the architecture of Alfred Hitchcock. Here today to talk with us about The Birds. But Michael, how did you come to Hitchcock?
Well, the journey is a strong word to say how I came to Hitchcock, because that suggests some sort of planning. But I came to Hitchcock through reading. As a child, I read books like, and I know this is radio or this is podcast, but Alfred Hitchcock's Spellbinders in Suspense. There were a lot of books in which he was paid to lend his name to collections of stories, usually edited by somebody else like Robert Arthur or Robert Bloch. And in fact, in this book, I first read the short story "The Birds" by Daphne du Maurier. So before I knew that it was a film, and by the time this book had come out, it had already been a film. But really, I got my start in Hitchcock with this series, Alfred Hitchcock and the Three Investigators. And in the original series, started in maybe '64, the year I was born. There were probably 30 books that ended up coming out by the time I stopped reading juvenile fiction. And this was another situation where Hitchcock lent his name for promotional purposes. And again, in the end papers here, you see Alfred Hitchcock's portly silhouette on the left behind a spider web.
Oh, that's so great.
And then you see the characters of the three investigators on the right, Jupiter Jones, Pete Crenshaw, and Bob Andrews. And these were the better written successor to the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. They were very imaginatively set in a salvage yard, the Jones Salvage Yard outside of L.A. And because the characters' families were often involved in the film industry, you got sort of little inside glimpses into that. And then, of course, at the end of every case, the boys met with Alfred Hitchcock in his office, and he promised to introduce that story in the next volume. So I didn't know Alfred Hitchcock was a real person for a while. And
he doesn't seem like a real person in the books.
That's right. But then I remember visiting often in the summers, we would go down to my paternal grandparents' house in Bennington, Vermont. And I remember vividly climbing this staircase next to a very big grandfather clock up to a bedroom with a small black and white television where accidentally one day I started watching the Alfred Hitchcock Presents show and was really captivated at, I don't know, 9 or 10 by these reruns that I knew weren't really for kids, but the atmospheric music, this kind of funny character who would introduce the programs, and then the storylines were very similar to the Agatha Christie mysteries that I was reading as a child. So first knew him as a fictional character in these adventure stories, then learned that he was a real person. And then at some point I probably saw The Birds on television, and that sort of sealed the deal. I became interested in Hitchcock. But again, it was the interest of a young fan, not someone who gave a thought to sort of pursuing that work. I mean, after all, as a 10 or 11 or 12-year-old, I wasn't even on the track of becoming an artist. And then after college, I went to Rhode Island School of Design. My first gig was teaching at Phillips Academy, Andover. And I was a teaching fellow for a year, 86 to 87. And so there were two kind of remarkable things that sealed my journey now, I think, toward becoming interested in Hitchcock. One was that a colleague fell ill who was teaching a Hitchcock and literature course. And I agreed with very little knowledge to take over that course in addition to my art teaching duties. And so I was watching or rewatching the films on VHS a week before I was teaching them to the students. And they say there's often no better way to learn something than by teaching it. And then, in a remarkable coincidence, the custodian in the main administration building at Phillips Academy was an elderly gentleman who was a clone of Alfred Hitchcock visually. So every day when I came into this building to teach, because I didn't teach my Hitchcock course in the art building, I taught it in this admin building, I would see this doppelganger. And, to me, it was an interesting kind of omen or sign. And so I think from that point forward, I really began to pursue Hitchcock studies, reading on my own, acquiring the books as they would come out, as I was able to afford them. And eventually I began making artwork not only in homage to some of Hitchcock films like Vertigo and Psycho, but I began to think more seriously about how his work had influenced me as an artist. So it wasn't just the content that I was responding to. I think it was technical ideas. I think it was professional ideas, like Hitchcock insisting on his name being ahead of the titles in his American films. So when I started doing my own solo exhibitions, it was Michael Oatman's Menagerie or Michael Oatman's Ark or something along those lines. And the other big idea that I picked up from Hitchcock is a very famous quote, which is that style is self-plagiarism. So as I emerged as a former painter, becoming a collage artist, becoming an installation artist, I decided that there would be some ground rules for my image making. That is to say, as a collage artist, many people value collage because of bringing really disparate elements together, often not from the same time period and with ripped edges, and the kind of collage we think of when we think of Kurt Schwitter's or Robert Rauschenberg. I wanted my collages to be seamless, integrating the visual voices, if you will, of 10, 50, 100 different artists into one image. And in fact, a piece of mine that's owned by the Albany Institute of History and Art is called The Birds, and it's a 12-foot by 8-foot collage of 150 bird species with different modern weapons tucked under their wings. So it's a kind of apocalyptic landscape, kind of like Bruegel or Bosch. And that film is a direct reference to Hitchcock, but it's also a kind of look at the animal kingdom in revolt, which I think is, in some sense, what The Birds is about. I was going to bring some other props, including the weirdest promotional item I've ever seen, but I couldn't find it. It came in a DVD box set, probably 20 years ago, re-release of Hitchcock's films, and it's an inflatable pillow, black on the back, clear on the front with his silhouette, but then it's covered with bird poop, white bird poop. And it's not a good look on a pillow. It's
yeah.
Strange object. Someone was quite perverse.
It struck me that your work in collage does have some affinity with Hitchcock's work, where he takes disparate elements and assembles them together, maybe with more medium unity, perhaps, than a true collage.
Right.
But he's always assembling things from wherever he can grab them.
I'm so glad you brought this up, Justin, because I think that for me, the hidden power of Hitchcock, and something it took me a long time to come to, and I feel dumb about this because, I am a collage artist, is that a lot of the power in his work comes from things not perfectly fitting. So you've got Hitchcock's rear projection fascination, which he uses long after they've figured out better ways to do this. Green screening. You've got the use of matte painting, and then, a live piece of film within that surrounded by a matte. You've got the rotoscoping. There's a moment in The Birds where the two lead characters, played by Rod Taylor, and Tippi Hedren are standing on a hillside, and it's obviously shot in the studio, at least part of it. So there's an artificiality to it, which to my mind is what adds the dreamlike quality to most of what Hitchcock does. There's also a scene very similar in Torn Curtain with Paul Newman. And there's another outdoor scene, which is clearly shot in a controlled studio. But the rest of the scene is shot outside. And I think he brings us close to the viewer as a way of highlighting the dissonance, the kind of nightmare-like quality of the situation that they find themselves in. And because The Birds is the ultimate collage film, in a way. I mean, you've got hundreds of real birds. You've got mechanical birds. You've got bird silhouettes. You've got rotoscope birds. And then both the sounds of real birds and then the electronic sounds of this musicless soundtrack coming together. The overall effect is one of sort of uber collage. It's one of the greatest collages ever made, in my opinion, and it's a motion picture. So to me, there's a great affinity there between what you can get from collage in terms of one thing plus another thing equaling a third thing that neither of them can accomplish on their own. But then you've got the layer of narrative. You've got the Hitchcockian control over the tension in the story and how that builds and releases. And in The Birds, it's often funny. It's a terrifying movie, but there's a scene, for instance, in which Melanie Daniels, played by Tippi Hedren, is driving to deliver a pair of lovebirds to this guy that she's sort of annoyed / fascinated by. And as she's driving in her sports car up the coastline, we cut to a shot of the two parakeets that she's bought in a cage on the floor. And of course, they're not real birds. They're sort of gimbaled, and the birds lean as the car turns to the left and the car turns to the right, almost like, how heads move in a tennis match. And it's a very funny moment. Not that there's much tension to relieve yet, but I think we're being built up. And even in that little humorous moment, there's two birds in a cage, two birds trapped, two birds together. And that symbolism goes a long way in a movie like this. And it's collage.
That moment is, for me, that whole first part of The Birds is very interesting to me because it starts off feeling almost like a different movie.
Oh, it's a screwball comedy, for sure. I mean, as we see, well, from the opening credits, there's a lot of confusion about the movie because we see, for instance, the Universal logo. I've thought about this maybe too much. Is a black and white image of the Earth. It's almost like a flat Earth, right? And then we see the animation of the credits being eaten away by birds as they kind of flock by.
And very strong sound. I wouldn't say it's music, but it's almost music concrete.
No, Bernard Herrmann, I think, advised Hitchcock and Oscar Sala, and I forget the other person who were using this 1920s electronic instrument to kind of create these bird and nature noises. So that opening title sequence is very abstract. It's like a Jackson Pollock painting happening in front of your eyes. And then we cut to downtown San Francisco, which has been already immortalized by Hitchcock in Vertigo. It's clear that he's quoting himself again in this, so this is a little self-plagiarism. We see the Golden Gate Bridge on a poster, and we think for a second we're there, but it's actually on a poster. And then as we're introduced to Melanie Daniels, Tippi Hedren's character, she goes into a pet store and turns her head at the sound of a wolf whistle and smiles. And as she heads into the store, Hitchcock makes his cameo coming out with his two white terriers. And then when we're in that store, Melanie Daniels is interested in this guy who comes in, and he mistakes her for the salesperson. And so she, being a natural kind of prankster and liar, steps into that role and starts giving totally incorrect information about the birds that this guy's looking for. He's looking for lovebirds for a present for his niece. And finally, there's a moment when she's unconfidently taking a bird out of the cage to show to him, and it escapes. And they end up chasing the bird around, and he captured it with his hat, I think. And then he says,
"Back in your gilded cage, Melanie Daniels."
"Back in your cage, Melanie Daniels." And she's like, "Who are you?" And he's a lawyer, and he realizes that, or she realizes that he's sort of mocking her for her many, what we would call now influencer appearances in the local papers as the heir to a great fortune. So she's, of course, tempted by this and lured to get back at him, but she's also a little bit curious about this rival.
It's a nice meet cute. It's almost shop around the corner-ish.
It is.
But at the same time, just a few minutes before, we had this terrifying bird collage that was letting us know that's like something not good is about to happen. And
Something
then
unnatural.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then here we have this, it's kind of cute, but also there's a undercurrent, I feel, of a little bit of menace, even in those early moments between the two of them.
Oh, true.
Sense of deception.
I mean, there's there's a few quick cuts to the square outside the pet shop, and birds are massing in the sky, and she looks up, and other people are looking up, and we even see, probably not intentional, but with Hitchcock, you want to read into everything. There's a BOAC sign, British Overseas Air Corporation, which is about flying and flight, of course. It's the big bird, and so. There's all these little pieces of the puzzle that start to add up. And in fact, that opening title sequence collage, feels like a puzzle with pieces missing. Like you're never going to see it all at once. Meaning, I think you're never going to understand what's happening.
I wonder if the somewhat contrived moments in which she decides to go up to essentially
Bodega Bay, yeah.
Bodega Bay to kind of stalk him. I wonder if that plays.
It's a kinder, gentler stalking from an earlier era.
Yeah, to my read now, it feels a little bit more menacing than maybe it would have at the time, but it still is a bold and unorthodox move. That's a little bit beyond meet cute.
Well, I think that Hitchcock is famously accused of both misogyny on one hand and creating very liberated female characters on the other. This is the move of a moneyed, independent person who's a free spirit, a kind of prankster, almost like a frat brother, like in her ability to cause mayhem in public.
She has a lot of agency.
She does. She has a huge amount of agency. She's going to use it. She's going to go after what she wants. She's at least going to get some satisfaction of having the last word, right, by delivering these lovebirds, tracking him down. And Melanie Daniels is a bit like a detective in this sense. And of course, the detective figure looms large in Hitchcock, largely because the detectives, like in many of the great detective stories, are often trying to answer some question about themselves. So, so she tracks down her man. And I think that the way in which she meets him again is very hard fought for this time. She enters Bodega Bay, which is a real place that Hitchcock, scouted and photographed every man, woman, and child as potential extras. Very thorough. But as she comes into the bay and then asks for directions, she's, it's pointed out to her where he lives. It's across the bay. She charters a boat, and he kind of realizes what's happening, and then he drives around, and she's trying to beat him across. She's headed across the bay to drop off the birds. Does that. He catches her leaving in the boat. He gets in his car and races around the lake as she's going back. And as she's nearing the dock, a single bird comes and attacks her and, hits her forehead with the beak, producing some blood. And so the meet cute, because we see them grinning at each other from the dock, is mitigated by this anomaly. So
it feels very tense. We also, right before the bird attack, when she's going in the boat, and you have this kind of a POV shot that wanders around, kind of looking, spying at
That's
it.
right.
And the sound, the diegetic kind of bird noise cuts out, and you get a moment of like apprehensive silence. And then later on, shortly
Right.
after that, we have the first bird attack, and
Yeah.
we're primed for that to land in a maximum way.
I think you're right, and this is also part of Hitchcock's plan to maximize silence, right? To really use sound in this movie in a way that it's never been used before, and the idea of no music, a non-musical score guided by a great composer like Herman, so that it operates in the way that music does: crescendos, fades, ponderous silences, staccato notes, sounds in the distance, sounds in the foreground. In fact, I brought with me one quote that I wrote down on this Post-it
Okay.
to make sure I got it right. This is a note to Herman and a note to Oscar Sala and the other, I think, Glassman, the other operators of that instrument, that electronic instrument. An electronic silence, a sort of acoustic low hum, electronic low hum, that ought to suggest the sound of the sea in the distance. So this is one note among hundreds that are attached to cues in the movie toward how this admittedly artificial sounding bird soundtrack should read. Not read, but sort of sound to the viewer. And so the idea of using the soundtrack in a way that music does to manipulate emotions is very powerful. In fact, years later, when DVD extras began to appear on discs, I forget which year it was, but there's a documentary about the Byrds in which they ridiculously layer suspenseful music over the clips that they're playing. Completely kills it, right? Makes it, unsexy, unemotional, unsuspenseful.
Yeah.
And this is precisely, why Hitchcock was an innovator. He knew that you had to do certain things, not just, thoroughly, but beyond, what the limits were, right? So to really commit to a movie in which there's no music, but in which there's the musicality of nature, the acoustical reverberance of big spaces or close spaces. And this goes back to your collage, observation. There's a scene in The Birds inside the house in which the birds come down through the chimney and populate the room. And what we're seeing is 3 or 4 layers of overprinting.
That's the first bird invasion, I think.
This is the bird invasion in the house. And what precedes it is this slight staccato pecking noise, a kind of bird drone in the distance outside the house. But finally, when all that comes together, when the birds burst through the unboarded up fireplace, the total layering of several scales of birds flying around, the sounds near and far, the mayhemic movements of the figures in there. It is, again, like another Jackson Pollock painting, but we're seeing it being painted, or maybe 5 of them at the same time. And it's a sonic painting, it's a visual painting, and it's really an overwhelming image. When I heard that some Hollywood powers that be were considering remaking The Birds, I thought, of all the movies to not remake, I don't know how you can get anything better, because with today's technology, you could get perfect resolution of the birds and the scales. But again, what part of the power of this movie is that there are things that don't work, that don't align spatially, that are real birds, that are artificial ones. It's that incredible defamiliarizing layer that is so powerful in this movie, because there's things that you as a viewer can't even follow. They're happening so fast. It's a movie that moves faster than the power of thought. So
Santa Rosa, in contrast to Bodega Bay, seems really interesting. Bodega Bay is not another Santa Rosa. It's not sonically nor in its character.
Santa Rosa is a transplant town. I mean, I find very humorous that the guy who owns the hardware store, who gives her directions, has a Maine or Boston accent.
Oh, right, and in the diner, there's an Irish.
That's right.
Very Irish,
right.
man.
Well, also the diner scene. We could talk a lot about that diner scene. I mean, that diner scene evokes everything from God to witchcraft. To the supernatural.
Incredible dynamics, very Rockwellian in its in the first part of it, and then after the main attack where everything's blowing up, very feels like a Twilight Zone episode after that.
It's true, and as someone who probably arguably influenced the Twilight Zone more than any other person, right? That kind of Hitchcockian, again, Rockwellian. Power is due to these contrasts. I mean, I think that Santa Rosa had a population of...
Bodega Bay.
That's right. Bodega Bay had a population
I'm
of
jumping around movies.
A couple thousand.
Yeah.
And Santa Rosa was a more robust small town. But to me, there are so many coincidences between these two movies. It's quite interesting that I was asked to introduce these two because, Hume Cronin is in Shadow of a Doubt. His wife, Jessica Tandy, who rarely acted on the big screen, is Lydia Brenner in The Birds. There are many similarities between the way in which the music was conceived of and used between both movies. They're both small towns that are corrupted from within, one by unknowable forces of nature, the other by a family member. And so the very deliberate choice, when Hitchcock uses a big city, he draws on the potential for anonymity. Of course, in a small town, everybody knows who you are. Everybody knows who your business is, what your business is. And Mitch Brenner is a famous bachelor, famously prevented from being with women by his, domineering mother who doesn't want to be abandoned. His girlfriend, Annie, and of course we have an Anne also in Shadow of a Doubt, is played by the young Suzanne Plachette, a school teacher, who is, in some ways, carrying a torch for Mitch. And it's not like he's abandoned her, but Mitch seems to be doomed to take care of his mother and take care of his little sister. I mean, he is sort of he's the new patriarch. He's the big brother. He's the person who the sister and the mother can't stand to see him be sexualized. And so for all those reasons, Melanie Daniels, this exotic person who comes to town, has the power to sort of steal him away. But in the end, she is accepted by the mother and ministered to as a mother would to her frightened child. And so, another incredibly complex movie about marriage, about relationships, about I would say, upsetting or interfering with the natural order of things. Certainly when Norman Bates kills his mother in Psycho, that is, playing with the natural order of things. And again, two movies which have a great deal in common in terms of their shock value, their narratives, and this idea that there are things that we're just never going to understand. We just have to sort of accept them as they are.
Is The Birds a horror film?
I think I will make this case that I think The Birds is an early cli-fi film.
Oh, tell us more. What does that mean to you?
So climate fiction is sort of the cousin of sci-fi. Think of 2012 or any of the recent films dealing with global warming, right? So climate fiction. The Birds is about nature kind of, if not taking revenge, nature pushing back on human progress, the manipulation of the genome, polluting the environment, bad energy policies, the idea that we are not part of nature anymore. A good friend of mine, a great collage artist named Todd Bartell, for a couple of years ago, was researching moments in Webster's and other famous world dictionaries and encyclopedias where man was defined as part of nature, and then the moment in time when man was removed from the definition of nature. And it's a very powerful idea. Hitchcock himself has written about the atom and its power in the world, and it's I think this is the ultimate defamiliarizing object, if you will, Hitchcockian object, the idea that the atom is something that the world is composed of, and yet when you toy with it, as with the Manhattan Project, you unleash something into the world. And so the Birds, again, the great power of the Birds is that this thing is not explained. This was something that Evan Hunter, the screenwriter, was opposed to. So Evan Hunter, people may know more from his pen name of Ed McBain, 87th Precinct novels, of which he wrote many. Hunter was, Hitchcock and Hunter were interested in some of the same things. Of course, the origin story of the Birds by Du Maurier. But also there had been an article in the newspaper about bird attacks in a Northern California town. And so Hunter and Hitchcock put those two things together, moved the site of the Birds from, I think, Cornwall in Great Britain, a small farming community, really it's a grouping of houses, and transplants it to Bodega Bay. When I was researching, for this interview, I learned one really important fact, that something I've been wondering about for decades. What if Hitchcock had made a science fiction movie? This isn't science fiction, but it does speak to Ray Bradbury's great distinction of the difference between fantasy and science fiction. Have you ever heard this definition?
No, I haven't.
It's really great. It's fantasy is the thing that you want to happen and will never happen. Science fiction is the thing that you don't want to happen, but it will inevitably happen.
Oh, that's chilling. Yeah, very prescient.
So what I discovered was that Hitchcock was preparing a script based on a short story called The Mind Thing, which was a science fiction film project. So we narrowly missed, maybe because of this movie and its shooting schedule and the demands of the studios and his contracts, we missed seeing a Hitchcock true science fiction movie. And, because this movie comes out only 6 years before 2001, who knows what a Hitchcock science fiction movie would have done to that genre. I mean, science fiction and horror movies and monster movies, I think you can really point to Psycho as the first great horror movie that is about a man. In other words, not about Frankenstein or Dracula or some sort of chimeric monster. This is about a man who has a psychotic break and becomes a killer. The Birds is about the psychotic break of nature with humankind. And because that's not so easy to explain, audiences were very disquieted by this movie, and it didn't perform particularly well. I think over time it's seen as very prescient, a real masterpiece, a real precursor to the deep, important economic and political and moral conversations we're having now about how we're treating the planet. There's, as has been said, there's no planet B, right? Yeah, people are working on it. Right? Some crazy people are working on it, and some very well-intentioned people are working on it. But, the harbingers of this movie are really, again, only 6 years before the environmental movement begins. And I love the twinned sources that people point to for the beginning of the environmental movement. I think unscheduled 1968 photograph of planet Earth taken by Apollo, I think 8. That first image that we had of the Earth alone, this marble in a sea of darkness. And then the oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara, near UC Santa Barbara, which galvanized college students and really brought awareness to the incredible power of the super majors like ExxonMobil and other companies. And we've seen, numerous oil spills play out since then. So the Birds, again, was ahead of its time in terms of looking at the balance, or I guess the imbalance between man and nature.
Both of those instances that you mentioned adhere to what John Carpenter describes as part of the rule of horror, which is to make people feel safe and then to break that safety.
That's right.
And in the oil spill, we feel safe, we feel remote, and then suddenly the reality of it encroaches in an unexpected and visceral way, just the same as the Birds does. And it's a reality you can't reason with or bargain with, maybe.
That's right. Well, the course that I've taught now at RPI for 15 years was originally called The Man Next Door, Alfred Hitchcock and the Architecture of Fear. And its new title is Cinetecture, which is a sort of hybrid of cinema and architecture. And I've also done a few design studios where we've watched Hitchcock films as a premise to designing the William Devane Center for Hitchcock Studies, which, I've proposed in downtown Troy. And would have its own film festival associated with it, and also on the hillside near MPAC. And you may know that William Devane, who starred in Family Plot, Hitchcock's last picture, was from Albany.
Yeah.
And so
local son.
Yeah, a local hero, and a great actor who's been on The West Wing, and famously in the Tom Selleck. I can't remember the Jesse Stone pictures about a kind of Maine coastal cop, and William Devane plays his shrink, Dr. Dix, and so I forgot what the initial lead into this was, but
I was talking about the feeling of safety. And
that's right. So the title of the course was Alfred Hitchcock, Cinetecture of Alfred Hitchcock, but the original title was The Man Next Door. And I think one of the major ideas in Hitchcock's work, or several of the major ideas, are estrangement, defamiliarization, of course, mistaken identity, the wrong man. But in that idea of showing you something that functions well, that is what you expect and what you rely on every day, and then to break that somehow with this event that kind of takes you out of your waking dream into a nightmare, I think is essential to that work. So that idea of, as you say, establishing safety and then shattering it is why we're still watching Hitchcock, and why filmmakers, even new 17-year-old filmmakers with their phones, are watching Hitchcock still, because each movie is a little bit of a film course on its own. And going back to that idea of stylist self-plagiarism, I would say that Hitchcock has made two kinds of films. People would argue there are many different categories, but I would say that he's made, on one hand, the same film over and over again. The 39 Steps, North by Northwest, Topaz. And then he's made these other highly experimental anomalies, the self-produced black and white Psycho, The Birds with its radical soundtrack, and its radical theme of sort of climate fiction. A film like Rope with 9 single shots, almost like filming a real-time stage play. The first film about psychoanalysis, Spellbound. He punctuates a career of making the same film over and over again with these vivid experiments in style, technique, technology. I mean, the famous dolly zoom shot in Vertigo, which Hitchcock is credited with inventing, that's, like dollying forward and zooming back or doing it the opposite way, is what gives the viewer that feeling of vertigo, I think, 3 times in the film with the bell tower staircase. Those innovations are due to Hitchcock's deep familiarity with architecture, with lenses, with the way that sets work. We didn't really talk about this with Shadow of a Doubt, but because that because his crew went out to find to do scouting for locations, they found a perfect home in Santa Rosa and a perfect family to work with to rent the house from. The family was so delighted to have their house featured in the film, they had it repainted. And of course that killed it for Hitchcock because he wanted the slightly shabby, homey feel. Yeah. So without defying the $5,000 ban on building sets during wartime, Hitchcock, and we don't think of him as about sustainability, but he used reclaimed wood and former props and spends about $275 on new materials to rebuild that house on a soundstage in order to shoot it properly. In Rope, Hitchcock is moving huge refrigerator-sized cameras through walls that move apart silently, pushed by, union members to get the cameras through to make these incredible 9 shots. And when he's running out of film, he passes behind the chest of drawers. He passes behind a character and emerges from the other side. That film, to me, is a marvel of choreography, not unrelated to what he does just a few years earlier in Shadow of a Doubt, and I think deeply related to the compression of effects and camera work and choreography of actors that he had to pull off with the birds.
He seems to have modes like Shadow of a Doubt and Rope, where they're very interior spaces, versus the very exterior leaning the birds with nature in revolt. But I think actually, no, I think what I want to ask you about are the birds themselves. I had another train of thought, but
it's okay.
Let's talk about the birds and the birds.
Sure.
Because they are, as you said, a collage piece in of themselves, and they're also presented and portrayed with different types of birds, different proximity of birds, a growing proximity over the course of time. There's an incredible range and dynamic just in the central other character, which is an unnamed menace of birds.
That's right. I think that in the past 40 years, we've learned that the birds are sort of the direct descendant of dinosaurs, real monsters. There's probably not another larger set of the animal kingdom that's been studied more than birds. We have them as pets. We eat them, right? We study their skeletons, their digestive systems. We look at birds and amphibians increasingly as signs of problems with the environment.
The canary in the coal mine.
That's right. Right, literally the first warning animal, right? And so it makes a lot of sense to me that this is the birds and not the toads, right? Or the beagles. So I think that the choice of birds goes back to mythologies from many cultures. I mean, Joseph Campbell has a lot to say about birds as harbingers, as companions in the hunt and in warfare. I mean, the birds send messages during times of war. The passenger pigeon became extinct because of the loss of a food source. the moths that they couldn't see in cities anymore, where soot was making it easier for the moths to camouflage themselves. And so evolution, I think, plays a large part of it. There's, of course, the famous example of the dodo. Who's the dodo in this sense? You know, it may be us playing with nature in the wrong way. But the birds in this film, we also know, are many of them are the smartest birds, ravens and crows. I don't think you have to look at any more potent symbol in this film than in the massing of the crows on the jungle gym behind Melody Daniels as she's outside the school where her new friend Annie and Mitch's former lover is teaching. And so, the shots cut to Melanie and her lighting up a cigarette, and then we see the jungle gym in the background and a bird lands, and then we cut back to her as she's fidgeting, and then some more birds land, and then finally we look up and the whole jungle gym is covered with birds. It's something that we see a lot in Troy, New York.
The famous Troy crows.
The famous Troy crows. Every few weeks we're reminded that, this Hitchcock fantasy is not too far removed from reality.
Deeply socially polarizing.
That's right. And then when the birds finally take flight off that gym, it is the full-on terror moment where go is hit in this film. And we see children running down the street. We see glasses stepped on and crushed. We see the children fleeing. There's a great artificiality in that shot, too. I mean, you can tell that it's kind of a matte shot. But it's so full of energy. The editing is so quick. Hitchcock is learning from his own success with the shower scene in Psycho in that moment. And then, of course, for the rest of the film, inside that house, there are moments of quiet and moments of utter eruption when Melanie Daniels goes into a room and she sees that birds are sitting there calmly waiting, and then they attack. So the birds themselves, we can't talk about the birds themselves without talking about filming the movie and how dangerous it was for Tippi Hedren. How many animal wranglers there had to be, how much training the birds had to be subjected to in order to work at all, much less well. And so, and that leads me finally to that final scene, which Evan Hunter was deeply opposed to. I think it's one of the most powerful images in cinema history. And Hitchcock knew enough about what he was doing conceptually in that scene where, as the garage door raises, and that car is kind of slowly rolled out, we see the birds waiting, sort of passively, calmly. And remember, that scene is composed of live birds, mechanical birds, the silhouettes of birds. There's another kind of matte painting by Albert Whitlock of this ruined paradise with the sun breaking through in the end. And again, to me, it feels like a painting by Bruegel or Bosch or something. But the proof of the power of that image and why it was the right decision by Hitchcock is because as that film ends, for the first time in a Hitchcock film, the word "the end" does not appear. And I think that's like what happens at the end of Marvel films now when they set you up with the stinger after the credits for another little narrative clip. But in Hitchcock's film, it's both a suggestion that the birds aren't done with us and we're not done with the birds, that there will be future conflicts with nature, whether it's our inability to stay away from manipulating the atom, whether it's our inability to stay away from manipulating the genome for good or bad. I think that the ending of that film is maybe the most important moment in it. And something that Hunter, did not advocate for. And that just reminds me of, there are so many great set pieces and moments in this film, but among the greatest is is the massing of the birds over Bodega Bay from the point of view of the birds, which is that shot where we're up in the air looking down over the gas station. And people are in the diner. There's already been this discussion about, who Melanie Daniels is. Is she some evil being? All this trouble started when you showed up. And we see a single bird.
The mother in the diner, right?
That's right, the mother in the diner. We see a bird drift into the frame, kind of floating over the gas station, and then we see more come in, and then more come in, and then the frame once again, like the title credits and the chimney scene inside the house, fills with a kind of frenetic energy, a painterly energy of the birds, and the people in the diner are aghast, right, because the birds are looking down on the explosion of the gas station because the guy lit a cigarette while filling up with gas and doesn't see that there's already a trail of gas on the ground that then, sets the tanks on fire.
It's almost a screwball comedy moment. It could that set piece of cascading cause and effect. You could almost put that in What's Up, Doc? You could almost, except that the consequences are so grim, and
right.
we're prepared for how grim. Maybe we're not prepared for how grim they are.
It reminds me of a funny poem by a painter friend of mine, Keith Brumberg, that he wrote in college, which was a sinking ship offshore from an erupting volcano during a tsunami. Tragedy schmagedy. So it's funny. I've never thought of that as a kind of slapstick moment, but it's so much going wrong. Things are so out of control that Melanie Daniels, she runs outside to hide in a phone booth and becomes a bird in a cage, and the birds start attacking that phone booth. Right, she's seeking shelter. And so there's just like one more layer of confusion, of misdirection by Hitchcock, by just highlighting everything that's going wrong.
Phone booth is also where he does the head-on bird coming at the camera shot for the first time, right. I think, because he holds back on that. It seems like, that's a gun you can fire pretty early on, but he doesn't until that moment, right, hitting the glass, the beak straight on. Not just a flutter, but a dagger attacking you.
It's true, and he's not just hitting the glass; he's hitting the fourth wall of the very movie theater that we're in. Like we're in that booth with Melanie.
It's really coming at our faces.
That's right.
Yeah. He does it toward the end as well.
Yeah.
When she's
in that room upstairs, when the birds are literally, in real life, being thrown at her and scratching her. I think she got a detached eyelid out of one of those throws. Extremely traumatic. Yeah. She was in therapy for a while and then really wrote about the abuse that she received at the hands of Hitchcock in that movie, like physically. And it is a great performance from a person who was not trained as an actor. She was a model. Hitchcock paid something like $30,000 to have screen tests made of her with co-stars from previous movies, from Psycho, paid for a full wardrobe, the full lighting package. I think this was his way of communicating to her that she was going to be a star. She thought she was auditioning for an Alfred Hitchcock Presents episode. And what else could she think with no acting experience? But slowly he transforms her into a movie star in real life. And then she really confidently inhabits the role of this rich party girl. And then it's all the more powerful when she descends into a child at the end of it, because she's so traumatized in the story and maybe in real life by making this movie.
You mentioned the ending of the film not giving us the closure, the feeling of closure with the end, but also with the birds not being ever fully explained or motivated. You also don't get that on the ground with the characters in their personal lives. You don't get closure with them, really. You get a squeeze on the arm.
That's right. We don't know what's going to happen to any of them. We don't know what kind of young woman the little sister is going to grow up to be. We don't know how Melanie will recover. We know that maybe Mitch's mother has moved back into the position of a mother with a purpose, a mother with maybe a different purpose than minding her eligible son. She's got a sick person to heal now. And so it is maybe the most disquieting ending of any Hitchcock picture. I think many of them come with a sense of the unresolved, or how can this relationship possibly be a happy one going forward? At least they're safe for now. And that's, I think, the message at the end of this movie. They're safe. We're safe for now. But the sun is setting, and there's going to be another sun coming up tomorrow. And what's that going to bring in terms of our relationship with the birds or nature in general?
I think that's maybe a good place to wrap it up.
I was hoping for a cheerier note, but
Michael, thank you for being here.
It's been my great pleasure. They were great questions, and I look forward to seeing the films next week.
Great, thanks.
Reel 1 is filmed at Open Stage Media Studios and is directed and edited by Zeb Schmidt, produced by Paul Kazee and Justin Rivers.